Good morning, and it's my absolute pleasure to have with us this morning Sharon Wood-Dunn. Sharon is the owner of S. Wood Wilson Associates, and she's also the former staff director for AT&T and Verizon. Sharon has worked for over 25 years in human relations, labor relations, and business ethics. A focal point of Sharon's career was in leading workplace diversity and inclusion. And Sharon continues to lead and offer a workshop entitled Celebrate Diversity. Sharon and her husband John live in the Stonehouse community and are very active in our own wider community here in Williamsburg and in James City County. Sharon has served for 2 consecutive terms as the Vice President of Big Brothers Big Sisters of Greater Virginia Peninsula. She is an executive partner at William & Mary's School of Business, and Sharon and John are both very active at historic First Baptist Church, Williamsburg, which, as many of you know, started in 1776 as a church for slaves and former slaves in this area. There at historic First Baptist Church, Sharon serves as the chair of personnel, something she seems very much qualified for. Many of you at Stonehouse Presbyterian Church already know Sharon, as she and John have worshiped with us many, many times. Sharon is also very active in our wonderful Wednesday morning small group called Stepping Stones. And a couple weeks ago, she led a workshop there for the women of that group on a conversation on race and faith. And after that, I've been wanting to talk with Sharon on these 2 issues very much. And so it's just been great to have her here. And lastly, I want to share about her biography. Maybe the thing that Sharon's most proud about is that she's also the mother of 2 adult sons and the grandmother of 2 grandsons and 1 granddaughter, who all I'm sure she would love to talk for many, many hours on. Sharon's motto is, "Let's get to the heart of it." Thank you so much, Sharon, for being with us this morning.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Sharon, since your motto is, "Let's get to the heart of it," I want us to jump right in. These past few weeks, our entire nation, not just here in James City County or in Virginia, but all over our nation, and I think even all over our world, people have been having conversations and really facing the historic issues of racism and inequality and injustice. With these huge topics going on right now, to many of us, including many of us of faith, it can seem overwhelming. We may not know where to start in talking about it, addressing it, facing it, and especially how to act and how to be of help. So my first question to you is a big one, but it's this. What one message do you want the people of Stonehouse Presbyterian Church to leave with today on the issues of race and faith and justice?
That's an excellent question, Pastor, and I'm delighted to answer to the best of my ability. I would say 3 things: listen, learn, participate. And I'll explain a little bit about each one of those areas. Sometimes when we're listening, we don't hear the whole story because we're engaged in thinking, oh, how am I going to answer, or what question do I want to ask? But I'm going to challenge you to listen. I have to challenge myself as well for the whole story, because there are ramifications and there are lessons in that story. So let me just give you an example of one. Just a couple of weeks ago, right in our Williamsburg area, the owner of the pharmacy on Monticello Avenue called Prescription Shop wrote an article in our local paper, and she described how her lives, or their lives, are so different based on the color of their skin. And so in terms of safety, when they're working late at night to do inventory, what they actually need to do is to notify the local police, because all the stores around them are closed at that point, and they're moving around and there's lights going on, and they don't want to be mistaken for a perpetrator. In the same light, the face-to-face with the local community, with the police, is very important to them, so they know who they are. Because of course, if for some reason someone wants to come and jeopardize their business and they need to call for the emergency response, they don't want to be mistaken for the perpetrator. And so once again, that's an issue of them trying to adjust for their own safety. They have a car where they will deliver prescriptions, and they have highlighted the car with a big name and picture. And of course, we would say in marketing, well, that's good advertising, but it's also to keep them safe as they move around into different neighborhoods, and they're looking at the numbers just to be sure they have the right house. They don't want to be viewed as scanning the area to rob someone. So that's just a lesson in itself in terms of how different their experience is just to stay safe and be in business. When I think about learning, is that lesson, but I think we also need to understand our history. And so often, we are in Williamsburg, of all places, but we sometimes need to go well beyond that and look at the history that has really shaped this country. And I'm speaking to people of faith, and so when we look at the Bible, and we see in the Bible how it's been used to condone slavery and to bring about this feeling of superiority. We think of the story of Ham, a darker-skinned character in the Bible, and I'm not a minister, as you know, and I'm not even a historian, but I can tell you how this history has worked for me and my faith as it regards my relationship with God. I do know that God does not look at me as black or white, and he accepts me because I've accepted him as my personal Savior. But I want us to understand how that plays into our history and the way in which we treat one another. The other last part of that question regards our participation. I'm asked all the time, what should I do? How can I contribute? And I would have to say, as children who love God, first of all, to understand what God's mission is for you. He has a design for each one of us. And when I think about the scripture in Philippians 2 and 4 that speaks to us, not only be concerned about ourselves, but to be concerned about others, I understand that that's one of his issues for us, and that we can trust him as we relate with him, and he can guide us into those areas that we absolutely need to be a part of and participate. So I hope I've answered that question, because I have a question for you, Pastor, and that regards white privilege. So how do you see yourself, how would you describe it, and how do you see yourself benefiting by white privilege?
That's a big question and a great question, Sharon, and thank you for asking that. The first thing with white privilege is, honestly, that phrase, I think when I first heard it, I was defensive about. I think I first heard it as, this is something for me to feel guilty about, or lesser than, or it's something that says, I've never had real accomplishments or worked hard. And that's not what white privilege is. That's not what white privilege is saying. It is not something that's just meant for us to feel worse about ourselves and go home and live exactly the same. That's not helpful to anyone. What white privilege is a message that's meant to cause us to be more empathetic, more open, more listening. The message of white privilege is saying that those of us who have lighter skin color don't have the same experiences or injustices or fears or times that they've really struggled, same as our brothers and sisters who have had darker skin color in this nation and around our world. And it's a message that calls us to maybe reflect when we hear stories of injustice or oppression or people speaking out, and we say, well, I haven't experienced that way. It's in my own life. To maybe say, well, maybe others' experiences are different than yours. Maybe people are treated differently than I've been treated. And to check that and to challenge that. And so instead of it being all about guilt or me feeling worse as a person, it's instead, I think, a call for me to open myself up, to really listen and learn, as you said, and then to participate and help out on where we're hearing these stories of injustice and pain and struggle, and to then act on those. There's a lot of areas in my own life. I know I've experienced privilege, and especially white privilege. And some of the big ones, I'm not going to get into today some of the really big ones that are about economics and education and housing and the justice system. All those things I think are very true. But instead, I want to highlight some things that maybe we don't think about so much, and that have been especially made more aware for me in the past few years. The first is reflecting on the death of Ahmaud Arbery. He was killed while going for a run by himself. And for me, like I think a lot of people in our community, that may have hit home, because I'm not a great athlete by any means. I'm someone who, especially with a young daughter at home and work life, I like to go for runs and jogs and walks at night. And I go in areas that aren't my own neighborhood. I go Newtown in Williamsburg is a beautiful place. Colonial Williamsburg, even William of Mary's campus, is a beautiful place to run and walk at night. And I do that very often by myself as a pretty big guy. And I've never once worried, do people think I'm a threat? I've never once worried, are people going to be scared of me as I go through this? I've never thought, am I going to have the cops called on me for running or walking at night? And so the death of Ahmaud Arbery really opened me up to, there are people out there, especially people of color, who every time they go for a walk or a run, something that brings me life and joy and peace, that it can be something scary, that it can be something where they're worried, are people going to think I'm a threat when I'm going into their neighborhood? And that really deeply saddened me. I know there was a story I saw a couple weeks ago of a father who can't go for a walk in his own neighborhood unless he has either his dog walking with him or his 2 young daughters, because otherwise he worries that his neighbors will see him as a threat. And I think that's something for us to really face. I don't know quick or easy answers for that, but that's something that is absolutely not right. The second area is I like to go as well on vacations, and especially vacations to mountains, to where it's a little quieter, to country areas. And the last few years we've done some big trips with some friends, including some friends of color. And when we're in the mountains of Vermont or Colorado or elsewhere, it feels to me very peaceful, very relaxed. I feel very much not afraid of anything. But my friends of color, I know, are at much more high alert. They've been saying that they've shared that when they're there, they notice that they are some of the only people there who are of color. And they have to be aware of what people are maybe looking at them. When they're in a store, sometimes they feel safer having someone who's a white friend there with them. And so these places that feel like sanctuary to me, that feel safe, are actually feel less safe to them than big cities and big places that maybe some white people feel less safe at. They feel more safe because there's less standing out. There's less maybe eyes and judgment and less fear of, why are you here? What are you doing here? When that question is not brought to me. Those first 2 things are things I don't have quick or easy answers for, know what to do. The third thing I do want to mention is something I do think is something we can all do something more about. And that is one area of white privilege I've experienced was growing up, I saw images and stories and TV and shows and books of people who looked just like me all the time. In textbooks for schools and TV shows and storybooks I had growing up, I could see people who looked a lot like me, who were white males in all of them, and often they were the heroes. And so growing up, I thought I can do anything because I have people who look like me doing those things. And I've started to realize that that's not always the case for people of color, both boys of color and especially females of color, too, of seeing that same representation in books and in movies and shows. And so I felt more and more called these last couple of years as a pastor to make sure when we have storybooks for children that not all the characters in them are white. When we have authors, then not all of them are white. And I would say that children's books have done a great job with this. I know, though, adult books, and especially maybe on my own shelf, I could do a lot more with. If you look on my bookshelf for especially biblical studies and theological studies, there's a lot of white authors there and not a lot of people of color. And I think one thing I can do is make sure when we're doing studies, when we're doing lessons, when we have books out for children and families, whenever I'm teaching, that's not just white voices or white images, but it's also people of color being represented. So thank you so much for that wonderful question, Sharon. And you had shared as well one thing of privilege that I didn't realize growing up, a story about how when your two sons had to first start learning driver's ed, how you had to add something to that education.
Yes, that's really true. Our sons grew up in Connecticut in a very nice, affluent area, and when they were of age to drive, most of their friends, and they were white friends, would have these spanking new sports cars. And so we let them know right away that they were not getting one. Not that we couldn't afford it, but we did not want them to stand out any more than they normally would. And it is just very typical if you see a young person in a car that you're going to be a person of color, you're going to be pulled over. And so what we've told our boys is that you have to make sure when you're pulled over that both of your hands are on the top of the steering wheel. You don't make any sudden moves. And when you're speaking to the officer, you'll say officer. If you can see their name, you'll say Officer Brown, for instance. But always very respectful and don't make any sudden moves. When they ask you for your ID, you'll say, it's in my left pocket or in my right, and make sure you know the left from the right. Or it's in the glove compartment, but I would warn against the glove compartment because then you have to move across, and that could agitate a policeman if he thinks you're aggressive. And so those are just some of the things that we would tell our sons so that they de-escalate any possibility of an escalation in attitude or treatment that would be detrimental to them.
Yeah, thank you so much. And just hearing that story, I realized when I grew up doing driver's ed, that things like stop signs and if you're at a four-way stop sign, who goes first, that was hammered home. But what to do when police pulled over was not something my parents felt like they had to concern me on teaching in the same way. And we hope we get to a place where it's not one teaching for boys of color and one teaching for boys who look more like me, but that we're all treated the same. So thank you so much for sharing that personal story, Sharon.
You're welcome.
Yeah. So the third question I wanted to lift up in our conversation today is I wanted to leave us on maybe a positive note, on something that's hopeful and something that leads us all out today with a charge of something we can do. And so I wanted to ask Sharon, as you've been so active with not just Historic First Baptist and Stepping Stones, but I know also First Fridays and Boys and Girls Club and or Big Brothers, Big Sisters, I wanted to know, what are some specific ways that you are witnessing change and progress in our own community as it comes to racial equality, justice, and reconciliation?
Well, I would have to say hopeful and optimistic. Our church, where it's located, We're very proactive with other churches. Actually, there's a cluster of churches across denominations where we interact with. My pastor, Dr. Reginald Davis, is very outgoing and has a wonderful relationship with many of the pastors in the area. There's a gathering that's called Movement Day, and he's been a part of that. And it allows us to worship with one another, to fellowship with one another, and I'm really excited about that. Also, just last Saturday, there was to be a walk, which turned out to be a drive because of the rain and thunder. But it was organized by a community group, The Village, which does a wonderful job, not just for the community, but in the schools as well, and also local leaders. And what it turned out to be was a caravan of cars going through the neighborhoods, escorted by our local police into the neighborhoods where there were Black and African American areas, neighborhoods, Harriet Tubman and Highland Park. And those were the areas where African Americans were displaced when colonial Williamsburg came into being. They lived in the colonial Williamsburg area and had to move. And those are beautiful areas. So we took a drive through those areas and came back to First Baptist Church parking lot, which was overflowing with cars. So that was just so helpful, that act of support for families and others. And then, of course, speaking of the police, a couple of years ago, one of our local pastors from Chickahominy Baptist Church, the Apostle Harmon, and he initiated a covenant with our local law enforcement. And that covenant was just renewed earlier this year. And, you know, hopefully that could be the prototype for some communities. It's a matter of respect on both sides. And I can actually feel a little safer knowing that those disciplines are in place.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sharon. And I know we had a few people from Stonehouse, and I was able to be there a couple weeks ago as there was the rally at the Capitol, and that was for renewing that covenant that started between Reverend Corwin Hammond at Chickahominy Baptist Church and the police, which is a pretty unique covenant. I don't know if so many communities are doing this, and is one that should be really highlighted and lifted up and maybe shared with other places. It's a real, I think it's a really positive step for the faith community, for the Black community to know that there's a conversation and relationship with the police and those who are having some power in this area. I think that's a big, big step. I'm sure it was a big risk to start, and is one that I'm so grateful to hear you lift up. And one other that I want to mention that was at the rally was a group that started here about a year ago called Coming to the Table, which meets, I believe, once a month. I don't know if they've been meeting during this COVID time, but people of different color coming and sharing stories and learning together without so much of maybe a big agenda, except let's get to know and learn and then work for justice after we do that.
Yes.
So I want to close today by reading again our scripture reading for today, which comes from 1 Corinthians 13. It's one that for so many of us is familiar from weddings, but I don't think that was Paul's first intention for this. Instead, is how we as a community and a diverse community are often called to live as people of God. Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. And love never fails. When I was a child, I talked like a child. I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put the ways of childhood behind me. For now, we see only a reflection as in a mirror, but then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. And I especially love the last part of that. I think Paul's talking about is seeing God and knowing God more fully, but also each other, and seeing us face to face and knowing ourselves more fully. And so conversations like these, I feel extremely blessed to be a part of, and I think every time we do this, we are witnessing to the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Amen.
Thank you so much, Sharon, for joining with us this day. It's been an absolute pleasure, and so grateful to have you be a part of our community and to be someone who's connected to us as a church.
Thank you, Pastor.
Yeah.
Whew. Sorry, my ears have to recover. Okay, so I just press the button again to stop it, I guess.
I think so.
So, I'll slide